The workshop was buzzing with activity that day. It was an ordinary day at a high-tech engineering company, where skilled engineers worked on designing and improving complicated engines. The air was filled with the sound of tools clanking, computers clicking, and heated discussions about the latest technical challenges. Alex, a senior engineer, stood at the center of it all. He had been with the company for years, and everyone respected his expertise. His reputation for being smart and always having the right answers had earned him a place of authority in the team. Alex was known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. He could solve any problem that came his way, and he wasn't shy about letting people know it. His confidence often bordered on arrogance. He liked to show off, to prove that no one could match his skills. The younger engineers admired him, but they also learned to keep their distance when he was in one of his boastful moods. They knew better than to challenge him. At the far side of the workshop, Sophie, the receptionist, sat behind her desk. She was a simple woman, dressed in a neat but modest outfit, far removed from the world of engines and technical discussions. Sophie had only recently started working at the company, and her role was far from exciting. She answered phones, handled the mail, and greeted visitors. But there was something about Sophie that caught Alex's attention that day. Sophie had been quiet, always keeping to herself. She had a soft voice and a calm demeanor, traits that made her seem out of place in the loud and chaotic engineering environment. Most people didn't give her a second glance. But Alex, always looking for an opportunity to entertain himself, saw an opening. He had heard the engineers discussing an engine problem they couldn't solve, and an idea popped into his head. "Hey, Sophie," Alex called out, walking over to her desk with a grin on his face. "I've got a little challenge for you." Sophie looked up from her computer, her face unreadable. "You see, we've been trying to fix this engine issue for days, and no one can seem to figure it out." "I bet you can't solve it," Alex said, his voice dripping with mockery. The engineers, who were working nearby, looked up at the sound of Alex's voice. They saw the challenge and began to chuckle. Sophie raised an eyebrow, but she didn't respond right away. Alex, enjoying the attention, continued, "I mean, you don't even have a clue about engines, do you? It's a pretty complex problem, but hey, maybe you'll surprise us." Sophie's eyes flicked to the engineers, who were now watching with interest, clearly expecting her to back down. But Sophie didn't flinch. She took a moment, her eyes scanning the faces around her, before standing up. She wasn't upset or offended. She didn't even seem to care much about what Alex had said. Instead, she simply walked over to the workbench where the engine parts were scattered, still calm and composed. The engineers exchanged confused glances. What was Sophie doing? She wasn't an engineer. She was just the receptionist. This was supposed to be a joke, a way to entertain the team for a few minutes. They didn't think Sophie would even attempt to work on the engine. But Sophie didn't stop. She picked up a wrench, turned it in her hands, and started examining the engine. Her movements were precise, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. Alex, watching from a distance, felt a slight shift in his mood. He had expected Sophie to either refuse or look embarrassed. Instead, she looked completely at ease, as if this was exactly what she was supposed to be doing. A couple of the engineers snickered, thinking she was just playing around. But Sophie continued working, not minding the laughter or the disbelief in the room. Minutes passed, and Sophie showed no sign of stopping. Her hands moved with surprising skill, adjusting components, checking connections, and carefully inspecting the engine. The engineers, who had been skeptical at first, began to pay more attention. They had never seen someone work with such focus, especially not someone who didn't belong to their world. Alex watched too, feeling a mix of curiosity and doubt. What was she doing? Was she actually making progress? Sophie, unaware of the growing tension in the room, continued to work methodically. She wasn't in a rush, nor did she seem to care about the jokes or the doubts being whispered behind her. She simply fixed the problem, piece by piece, as if it were nothing more than a puzzle she was solving. The silence in the room grew heavier as time passed. No one had expected this. No one had expected Sophie to know what she was doing. And yet, there she was, working with the engine as if she had been trained for it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sophie stepped back. She wiped her hands on a cloth, then flipped a switch on the engine. The machine sputtered for a moment, then hummed to life. The problem that had stumped the engineers for days was now fixed. The engine ran smoothly, its parts clicking into place as if everything had been aligned just right. The room was silent. Everyone was staring at Sophie, their mouths hanging open in shock. Alex, the proud engineer who had dared her to try, stood frozen in disbelief. The engineers around him were just as stunned. They had been unable to fix the problem, but Sophie had done it without any fuss, without any hesitation. Alex's heart raced. He had never expected this outcome. Sophie, the receptionist, had solved the problem they couldn't even begin to understand. His confidence, once so strong, now felt fragile. The engineers, who had always looked up to him, now looked at him with a mixture of surprise and confusion. How could Sophie, of all people, have done this? Sophie stood there, calm and collected, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She simply turned to Alex, who was still trying to process what had just occurred. The issue was with the fuel injector, she explained, her voice steady. It wasn't calibrated correctly. I just adjusted it, and now everything works fine. Alex opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he knew more than anyone else in the room. And now, in front of everyone, Sophie had proven him wrong. The engineers, too, were starting to realize what had happened. They had underestimated Sophie, just as Alex had. They had dismissed her because she didn't fit the image of an engineer. But now, it was clear, Sophie had a talent they had never expected. The room was thick with silence. Sophie stood next to the engine, her expression calm as if nothing unusual had just taken place. The engine hummed steadily, and the once complicated problem was now solved, all because of her quiet, deliberate actions. The engineers who had watched with skepticism were still in disbelief, staring at the engine and then back at Sophie, unsure how to react. Alex, who had challenged her in the first place, found himself unable to speak. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. He had expected Sophie to fumble, to be out of her depth, but instead, she had stepped in and done what none of the engineers could. The shock was sinking in, and with it came an uncomfortable realization he had misjudged her, severely. Sophie, however, seemed unaffected by the sudden attention. She simply wiped her hands on the cloth she had grabbed earlier, keeping her focus on the engine for a moment longer before turning around to face Alex and the others. It was clear to everyone in the room that she wasn't looking for praise or recognition. She wasn't one to boast or gloat. Her quiet confidence spoke volumes, and that in itself was powerful. Finally, Alex cleared his throat, attempting to regain some of the authority he had lost in the last few minutes. I didn't expect that, he admitted, his voice sounding much smaller than usual. He looked at Sophie, trying to make sense of it. How did you? I mean, you're not even an engineer. How did you know what to do? Sophie met his gaze without hesitation. I've always had an interest in machines, she explained simply. My father's a mechanic. He taught me a lot about engines when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time working with him on car repairs. When I saw the engine problem here, I just did what I've always done. I looked at the parts and figured out where the issue was. There was no pride in her voice, no attempt to prove anything. She was simply telling them the truth, as if solving engine problems was the most natural thing in the world. Alex and the engineers, however, were stunned. They hadn't expected such an answer. They hadn't expected her to have any background in mechanics at all. To them, Sophie was just the receptionist, the person who took phone calls and greeted visitors. They had never thought of her as someone who could contribute to the technical side of things. The engineers exchanged glances, their disbelief still evident on their faces. They had spent hours trying to fix that engine, and now, in a matter of minutes, Sophie had done what they couldn't. It felt unreal to them, like they were in a strange dream. One of the younger engineers, Mike, finally spoke up. "So, you've been working on engines for years?" He sounded a little awestruck. Sophie nodded. "Not professionally, just with my dad. He's been fixing cars for as long as I can remember. It's where I learned the basics." Mike blinked. "But, you've never worked on this kind of engine before, right?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity and a bit of disbelief. "No," Sophie replied, "but the principles are the same. Engines are engines, no matter how complex they look." Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet wisdom in her words. It was as if she had known all along that the solution wasn't out of reach, and the only thing that mattered was taking the time to figure it out. Alex was still processing everything. The words Sophie had just spoken sank in, but the reality of the situation still felt surreal. He had been so quick to underestimate her, to assume that because she didn't wear a lab coat or carry a toolkit, she couldn't possibly know anything about engines. He had assumed that because she worked at a desk, answering phones and scheduling meetings, she was somehow less capable than the engineers who had spent years studying mechanical systems. He couldn't have been more wrong. He let out a heavy sigh and rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over him. "I guess I owe you an apology," Alex admitted, his tone more humble than he'd ever allowed it to be before. "I didn't think you'd be able to do it. I'm sorry for doubting you." Sophie smiled slightly, a small but genuine smile that didn't seek any recognition. "It's okay," she said quietly. "I wasn't looking for an apology. I just wanted to help." The room had become quieter as the engineers absorbed what had just happened. It wasn't just about fixing the engine, it was about the lesson they had just learned. They had all witnessed how easily they had underestimated Sophie. And in doing so, they had learned a valuable lesson about judgment, about assuming things based on appearances and roles, without really understanding the depth of someone's knowledge or experience. Alex couldn't help but reflect on his own behavior. He had seen Sophie as nothing more than a receptionist, someone who answered phones and directed people to the right offices. He had never once considered that she might have valuable skills outside of her job title. Now, he saw the flaw in his thinking. He had made a snap judgment about her based on her outward appearance, and he had been completely wrong. As Sophie quietly returned to her desk, Alex stood there for a moment, thinking about how much he had just learned. He had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, but today, Sophie had shown him that intelligence comes in many forms and that everyone has something valuable to offer, even those you least expect. The other engineers, too, were beginning to rethink their earlier assumptions. They had seen how easily they had dismissed Sophie, how quickly they had assumed that someone who didn't fit their mold could never contribute to the technical work they did. Now, they realized that they had been just as guilty of bias as Alex. Mike, still in shock, shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe we all missed it," he said. "You've been right here all along, and we never thought to ask if you could help." Sophie glanced over at him. "It's not your fault. You just didn't know." The tension in the room began to lift as the engineers slowly adjusted to the new reality. Sophie wasn't just the receptionist. She was someone with real skill, someone who had quietly observed and learned things that none of them had even considered. She wasn't part of their engineering team, but she had just proven that she could be an equal when it came to problem solving. Alex finally broke the silence again, this time with a smile, though it was tempered by a deep sense of respect. "From now on, I'll be careful who I doubt," he said, offering a hand to Sophie. "You've earned my respect." Sophie shook his hand, her smile growing slightly. "Thank you. But remember, it's not about respect. It's about doing what needs to be done." As the engineers continued to reflect on what had happened, they realized that the true lesson wasn't just about solving the engine problem. It was about looking beyond titles, roles, and appearances. It was about recognizing the skills and experiences that everyone brings to the table, no matter their background. And it was about humility, understanding that even those who seem the least likely to help can end up being the ones who make the biggest difference. From that day on, Alex and the rest of the engineers would never again underestimate someone based on their outward appearance. They would remember the day Sophie had taught them the most important lesson of all, that knowledge and skill are not always where you expect to find them. The days following Sophie's unexpected success in fixing the engine were filled with a newfound sense of respect and humility in the workshop. Alex, still shaken by the events, found himself thinking about the way he had judged Sophie so harshly. Every time he passed her desk, he couldn't help but wonder how many other people he had underestimated in his career, how many had slipped under his radar simply because they didn't fit the image he had in mind of who could be useful in a technical environment. For the first time, he realized that his sense of superiority was based on nothing more than pride, a pride he had built over the years but never questioned. Now, he was questioning everything. He had spent so much of his life assuming that expertise could only come from formal training or high positions. He had never once considered that the receptionist sitting quietly behind a desk might know more about engines than he did. As the days passed, Alex became more aware of his colleagues' new attitude toward Sophie. It wasn't just Alex who had misjudged her, the entire team had. Sophie had always been part of the team, even if no one had acknowledged it before. But now, things had changed. People began to see her differently. The engineers, who had once ignored her presence in the room, now sought her opinion when they faced challenges. One afternoon, as Alex was working on a complicated design, he overheard Mike, the youngest engineer on the team, chatting with Sophie. Mike had been one of the engineers who had laughed when Alex made the challenge. He had been skeptical too, but now, he seemed eager to learn from Sophie. "So, you grew up fixing engines with your dad?" Mike asked, genuinely interested. Sophie nodded as she worked on organizing some paperwork. "Yeah, my dad was a mechanic, and he used to take me along when he worked on cars. He never treated me like I was too young to help. He taught me how to take things apart, fix them, and put them back together. I guess it just became second nature to me." Mike's eyes widened. "That's pretty amazing. I mean, I always thought you just answered phones and kept the office running smoothly." Sophie smiled softly. "That's part of my job, but my knowledge of engines doesn't come from my job title. It comes from spending time with my dad and learning from him." Alex, who had been eavesdropping just out of sight, felt a twinge of embarrassment. He had never bothered to ask Sophie about her background. He had never taken the time to get to know her outside of her role. But now, hearing her talk about the way she had learned and the way she had been treated by her father, Alex realized how much he had missed. He had assumed that Sophie was just a simple receptionist, and because of that assumption, he had never considered the depth of her experiences. Later that afternoon, as Sophie walked past Alex's desk, she smiled and greeted him, but Alex felt a sense of unease. He hadn't yet properly apologized for the way he had treated her, and he knew he needed to. The challenge he had given her, the way he had dismissed her without a second thought, lingered in his mind. He had been so sure of himself, so convinced that no one could do his job better than he could. But Sophie had proven him wrong, and that realization hit him harder than anything else. Alex decided that he needed to make things right. He stood up from his desk and walked over to Sophie's workstation. She was typing something on her computer, focused on her task. "Sophie," Alex said, his voice a bit hesitant. Sophie looked up from her screen, her expression friendly but neutral. "Yes, Alex. I, wanted to apologize for the way I treated you that day," Alex said, his words coming out slower than he had intended. "I underestimated you, and I made a joke at your expense. I didn't think you could actually solve the engine problem, and I was wrong. I'm really sorry for that." Sophie paused for a moment, considering his apology. She could tell Alex wasn't just apologizing to smooth things over, there was sincerity in his words. Finally, she smiled and nodded. "It's okay, Alex," she said quietly. "I didn't take it personally. I know you didn't mean any harm. But I do appreciate you saying that." Alex let out a breath of relief. For the first time, he truly felt like he was starting to understand the impact of his actions. It wasn't just about fixing the engine, it was about the way he had treated Sophie, the way he had assumed she didn't have the knowledge or the skills. The fact that Sophie had been so humble about it, had never sought validation or made a fuss, made him respect her even more. As the weeks went by, Alex's perspective continued to shift. He began to look at the people around him differently, and he became more open to learning from others, no matter their background or job title. Sophie, in particular, had become someone he sought advice from, not just because of her mechanical knowledge, but because of the quiet wisdom she carried with her. One day, as the team worked on a new project involving engine design, Alex found himself stuck on a technical detail. He had been trying to figure out a solution for hours but couldn't make any progress. Without thinking, he turned to Sophie, who was sitting at her desk, typing away. "Sophie," he called out, "I've been stuck on this for a while. Can you take a look at it?" Sophie glanced up from her work and walked over to Alex's desk. She took a look at the design he was working on, her fingers lightly brushing over the blueprint. "This part here," she said, pointing to a specific section of the diagram, "it's not aligned properly. You need to adjust the angle slightly, so everything fits together better. It's a small adjustment, but it'll make a big difference." Alex felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Sophie hadn't hesitated to help him, and her advice was spot on. It was clear now that she had a mind for detail, and her ability to see things from a different perspective was something he had been blind to before. "Thanks, Sophie," he said, genuinely appreciative. "No problem," she replied with a smile. "Glad to help." The rest of the engineers watched the exchange with curiosity. They were starting to see Sophie in a new light, just as Alex had. They began to realize that her quiet contributions were just as valuable as the loud, high-profile work of the engineers. In fact, some of the most useful ideas came from Sophie, who never sought attention but always found a way to help when needed. Over time, Alex's relationship with Sophie evolved from one of doubt and condescension to one of respect and admiration. The entire team, once hesitant to listen to her, now turned to her for advice and insights. The shift wasn't just in the way they saw Sophie, it was in the way they saw each other. The engineers began to value each other's different perspectives, recognizing that everyone, regardless of their role, had something important to offer. And for Alex, it was a lesson he would never forget, that intelligence and expertise don't always come wrapped in a neat package. Sometimes, the most valuable people are the ones who don't fit the mold you expect. And they often have the most to teach you. The weeks following Alex's humbling experience with Sophie were marked by a shift in the entire workshop's atmosphere. It wasn't just the fact that Sophie had fixed the engine problem, it was the way her quiet confidence had changed the way everyone viewed each other. The engineers, once so quick to judge anyone who wasn't part of their technical team, now found themselves paying more attention to the skills and knowledge of everyone around them. and Alex, who had been so certain of his superiority, was now learning valuable lessons from someone he had once dismissed as simply the receptionist. At first, Alex had struggled with his pride. He had been the one to challenge Sophie, to make the joke about her solving the engine problem. But instead of the laughter he had expected, she had proven him wrong in the most unexpected way. He had spent days thinking about it, reflecting on his actions. He had been so wrapped up in his own confidence that he had failed to see the people around him for who they truly were. Now, every time he walked into the workshop, he couldn't help but feel a sense of humility, a reminder of how wrong he had been. It wasn't just Sophie's skills that had impressed Alex. It was her demeanor. Sophie had never once rubbed her success in his face or made him feel small. She hadn't even acted surprised when she solved the engine problem. She simply did what needed to be done and moved on. That level of grace, combined with her obvious technical knowledge, had made Alex realize just how much he still had to learn, not only about engines but about people as well. As time went on, Alex found himself approaching Sophie more and more. He would ask her opinion on certain designs or technical problems, and he was always impressed with how quickly she grasped complex ideas and offered simple, effective solutions. She didn't overcomplicate things. She didn't feel the need to explain everything in great detail. She just solved the problem. One day, Alex found himself stuck on a particularly difficult project. It was a new engine design that had a lot of moving parts, and no matter how many times he reviewed the plans, something just wasn't clicking. The solution seemed just out of reach. He had spent the better part of the afternoon on it, but the more he worked, the more frustrated he became. Finally, in a moment of desperation, he turned to Sophie. "Sophie," he said, his voice carrying a hint of frustration, "I've been looking at this design all afternoon, and I just can't seem to figure it out. Can you take a look?" Sophie, who had been busy working at her desk, didn't hesitate. She stood up and walked over to Alex's workstation. Alex noticed that she wasn't intimidated by the complexity of the design, nor did she seem to feel the pressure of solving the problem. She simply looked at it, her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were taking in the bigger picture. "All right," she said after a moment, "here's the issue." She pointed to a section of the design that Alex had missed. "The angle here is too steep. It's going to cause friction in the engine. You need to adjust the alignment, just slightly. That should fix the issue." Alex blinked, surprised by how simple the solution sounded. He had been so caught up in the technical details that he hadn't thought about the problem in such a straightforward way. Sophie's advice was precise, and within minutes, Alex made the adjustment she had suggested. The engine design worked perfectly. "Thanks, Sophie," Alex said, feeling both relieved and grateful. He had been stuck for hours, and in just a few moments, she had solved the problem. It wasn't just about the solution she had provided, though. It was the way she had approached the problem. Sophie hadn't been flustered or stressed. She had calmly assessed the situation and found a way to make it work. "Don't mention it," Sophie replied, her smile warm but modest. "That's what teamwork is for." Alex felt a deep sense of respect for Sophie. It wasn't just her technical skills that impressed him, it was her ability to remain calm and collected, no matter the situation. She wasn't in a rush to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need recognition or praise. She simply did the work, and that was something Alex had come to admire deeply. The engineers, too, began to recognize Sophie's value. They no longer saw her as just the receptionist. They saw her as an equal, someone whose knowledge and insights were just as important as theirs. As the weeks went on, they began to include her in discussions and brainstorming sessions. Sophie never pushed herself into the spotlight. She was never the first to speak up, but when she did, her contributions were always well thought out and invaluable. One day, the team was working on a new engine prototype, and they were having trouble with a specific component. It was a crucial part of the design, and no one could figure out why it wasn't working. As the engineers scratched their heads, Sophie stood quietly in the background, observing the group. After a few moments, she stepped forward. "I think I know what the issue is," she said, her voice calm. "The material you're using here isn't strong enough. It needs to be more durable to handle the pressure. If you switch to this alternative, it should solve the problem." The engineers exchanged surprised glances. They had been so focused on the design that they hadn't even considered the material. They quickly followed her suggestion, and sure enough, the component worked perfectly. It was a small change, but it made all the difference. Sophie's quiet confidence had become a beacon for the team. They began to appreciate her not just for her knowledge, but for her ability to bring clarity to even the most complicated situations. She wasn't flashy or loud, she didn't need to be. Her ability to listen, think critically, and offer simple solutions was what made her such a valuable part of the team. As the weeks turned into months, Alex found that his relationship with Sophie had grown into something that went beyond just professional respect. He had come to see her as a mentor of sorts. She had taught him not just about engines, but about humility, patience, and the importance of recognizing the strengths in others. One afternoon, as the team gathered for a meeting, Alex took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. He looked around the room at his colleagues, who were no longer just engineers in his eyes. They were a team, and they had learned to rely on each other's strengths. Sophie had played a huge role in that transformation, not just with her technical skills, but with her quiet wisdom and her ability to bring people together. As the meeting came to an end, Alex turned to Sophie and smiled. "You know, I used to think I had all the answers. But I've learned that I don't. And I've learned that everyone has something valuable to offer, no matter their role." Sophie smiled back, her expression soft. "We all have something to teach each other," she said, her voice steady and kind. "It's just a matter of being open to learning." Alex nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. He knew he had a lot more to learn, but he also knew that he was surrounded by people who could help him get there. And that, he realized, was the true value of teamwork, not just in solving technical problems, but in growing together, learning from one another, and appreciating the strengths each person brought to the table. As the workshop doors closed for the day, Alex couldn't help but feel thankful for the lesson Sophie had taught him. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the people. And he had learned, in the most unexpected way, that true greatness wasn't defined by a title, but by the ability to lift others up, to recognize their strengths, and to work together to achieve something greater than what any individual could do alone. As the months passed, the dynamic within the engineering team had transformed completely. What had started as a simple challenge from Alex to Sophie had turned into a deeper lesson for everyone involved. The team, once divided by hierarchy and role, was now more unified. Sophie, the receptionist, had proven that expertise and wisdom could come from unexpected places. Her calm demeanor, hands-on experience with engines, and quiet contributions had made her an integral part of the team, earning respect from everyone, including Alex. Sophie's role had expanded over time. While she had initially been tasked with answering phones and scheduling meetings, she had now become a trusted member of the engineering team. The engineers frequently asked for her input, whether they were working on a new engine design or troubleshooting existing ones. She had a way of looking at problems from a different perspective, and her suggestions were always valuable. What had once been a workshop filled with skeptical glances towards Sophie had now turned into a place where her expertise was sought after by the very engineers who had once doubted her. Alex, especially, had undergone a profound change. He had gone from being the one who assumed he knew everything to the one who was willing to learn from everyone around him, especially Sophie. He had been the senior engineer, the one who had led the team for years, but he had come to realize that true leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about recognizing the strengths in others, appreciating their unique talents, and using those talents to make the team stronger. Alex had learned that his arrogance had been a barrier to his own growth, and it had kept him from recognizing the value in those around him. It was one afternoon when Alex and Sophie were working side by side on a new engine prototype that the full scope of their partnership became clear. The project they were working on was one of the most complex they had ever undertaken, involving a new fuel system that could significantly improve engine efficiency. The team had been struggling with the system's design for weeks, and there were numerous issues to address. Alex had worked tirelessly on the prototype, but he was still hitting roadblocks. He sat at his desk, surrounded by blueprints and technical specifications, feeling frustrated. His usual approach of diving deeper into the technical details wasn't working, and the hours of work were starting to take their toll. Sophie had been observing him from across the room, as usual, quiet but aware of the situation. She walked over to him, her steps light, but her presence calm and reassuring. "Alex," Sophie said gently, her voice soft but clear, "I noticed you've been stuck on that part of the design for a while. Maybe it's time to step back and look at the bigger picture." Alex glanced up, his eyes tired, but he appreciated her observation. "I've been trying to fix this for hours, Sophie. I'm just not seeing it. It's like I'm missing something important, but I don't know what it is." Sophie took a deep breath and sat down beside him, her eyes scanning the blueprint. "Let me see if I can help," she said, her tone full of quiet confidence. She didn't ask for permission to intervene, she simply offered her help, as if it were a natural part of the process. Alex felt no need to object. He trusted her now, more than he ever had before. For a few moments, they both studied the design, the silence between them filled with the hum of their concentration. Sophie's eyes moved over the technical details, but she didn't seem to get caught up in the complexity. Instead, she focused on the key issue, the flow of fuel through the system. After a few minutes, she pointed to a specific section of the blueprint. "This part here," she said, "the pressure regulator is too sensitive. It's causing the system to overcompensate, which is why the engine is malfunctioning. You need to adjust the calibration here, and the whole system will run more smoothly." Alex's eyebrows furrowed. He had considered every other variable, but this simple observation had escaped him. It was such a small change, yet it could make all the difference. "I didn't think of that," he admitted. "I was so focused on the fuel flow that I missed the pressure regulator." Sophie smiled gently, her expression calm but knowing. "Sometimes, the smallest things make the biggest impact. You were looking at the details, but you weren't stepping back to see the whole picture." Alex paused, taking a moment to let her words sink in. It wasn't just about the design, it was about the way he had been approaching the problem. He had been so caught up in the technicalities, so focused on getting every single detail perfect, that he had missed the simple solution right in front of him. Sophie's ability to see things clearly, without getting lost in the complexity, was a skill he had come to respect deeply. He quickly made the adjustment she had suggested and tested the system. The results were immediate. The engine ran more smoothly than it ever had before. The calibration had been off, but now, with Sophie's help, it was perfect. Alex felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was a small adjustment, but it had been the key to solving the problem. "Thank you, Sophie," Alex said sincerely, his voice filled with gratitude. "You've helped me more than I can explain." Sophie smiled, but there was no pride in her expression. "I'm just happy I could help," she replied simply. The rest of the engineers, who had been watching the process from a distance, came over to see the results. They, too, were impressed with how quickly the issue had been resolved. Over time, they began to rely on Sophie more and more, not just for her mechanical knowledge, but for her ability to stay calm under pressure and see solutions where others saw only problems. She had become a silent leader in the workshop, guiding the team without ever trying to take the spotlight. As the months continued, the team's success grew. They completed more projects, solved more problems, and built a stronger bond than they had ever had before. And Alex, once the proud leader, had transformed into someone who understood the true value of teamwork. He had learned that leadership wasn't about always being right or having the best solution, it was about knowing when to step back and trust others. One afternoon, as the team gathered to celebrate the completion of another successful project, Alex stood up to give a short speech. He looked around at the engineers who had become his friends and colleagues, and then his gaze landed on Sophie, who was quietly sitting at the back of the room, content to observe. "I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone here," Alex said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "We've accomplished so much together, and I know I've learned a lot from each of you. But there's one person I need to thank, someone who taught me the most valuable lesson of all, Sophie." Sophie looked up, surprised by his words. Alex continued, his tone sincere. "Sophie, you've shown me what it means to be humble, to recognize the value in everyone, no matter their role. You've taught me that the best solutions come from seeing the bigger picture and that the smallest adjustments can make the biggest difference. You've been an incredible part of this team, and I want to thank you for everything." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone turned to Sophie, who blushed slightly but smiled warmly. "I don't deserve all that," she said softly, her voice humble. "I'm just happy to be part of the team." But Alex shook his head. "You deserve more than that, Sophie. You've made this team better, and you've made me a better person. I'm grateful for you." The engineers clapped, and Sophie's smile grew. It wasn't about the recognition or the praise, it was about knowing that she had helped make a difference. From that day on, Sophie was more than just the receptionist. She was an equal, a trusted member of the team, and a leader in her own quiet way. And Alex, once the proud engineer who had doubted her, had learned that true greatness wasn't about titles or positions. It was about the work you did, the people you helped, and the lessons you learned along the way. Together, they had become a team, bound not just by their shared goals, but by the respect they had for each other, and the understanding that everyone, no matter their background or job title, had something valuable to offer.